Right. Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Bookchanging podcast. I am the host, Tanner Jenkins, owner of Bookchanging, and I'm brought to you with my co-host, Chris. Say what's up to the people.
Thanks for having me back, bro.
Yes, sir. Another one. And this week, we are doing one of my favorite books. Again, this is another staple in my collection. The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. And for those who don't know, I've read most of Holiday's work, and I've actually shared it on my Bookchanging page, all my favorite excerpts from his work. So I've read Ego is the Enemy.
Which I'm currently reading right now.
You're currently reading Perennial Seller, Conspiracy, and then Trust Me, I'm Lying. And of all those books, of all his books, this book, Obstacle is the Way, and Ego is the Enemy are my favorites. Also, I've read Daily Stoic and then the Daily Stoic Journal, which are also about Stoicism, right? And so just to start off, a little bit of background about The Obstacle is the Way and what you can expect if you pick it up. It's essentially a mixture of Stoic philosophy with stories of historical figures, right? And some of those historical figures, I will read a list that he mentions. Figures like Thomas Jefferson, Amelia Earhart, Thomas Edison, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and Steve Jobs.
Now, these are people that practice Stoicism.
Yep. Even though they may not have been aware of it, right?
For sure.
They just exude those Stoic principles in their actions, and that's what separates them from the rest of people, right?
For sure.
And so, to dive into it, it's the book is broken down into 3 different sections, right? So he has perception, action, and will, and he claims that these 3 parts of the book, no matter the obstacle or circumstance, we are always able to control these 3 aspects, right? We can always control our perception, our action, and our will.
For sure.
And we'll start with perception. So he says 2 quotes from the perception section of the book. The extent of the struggle determines the extent of the growth. And another one, problems are rarely as bad as we think, or rather they are precisely as bad as we think. And I think these 2 quotes just are a perfect example of the correct perspective to approach obstacles with. So he says, we can always choose to look at our obstacles as an opportunity to grow, an opportunity to maybe share more love or figure out more patience, how we can do these things differently.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is, in the beginning you mentioned a lot of these people that you list off, they weren't even aware that they were practicing Stoicism. Yep. Whether they were aware or not. And I think a lot of us fall into that category as well. For example, myself, I've always said no matter what situation you're in, once you come out of it, there's always a positive that you can take from it. Whether it's a negative, obviously if it's a positive situation, you can take something good from it. But whatever negative situation, I haven't found one myself that I couldn't take something positive from it. That kind of reflects on the quotes that you just read. Choosing to look at the situation and the obstacle to grab something positive from it. And 100%. like I've always said, bro, I've said this since I don't know, even since maybe I was 18 or something. When I go through something, I'm like, okay, what can I learn from this? What can I take out that's positive? I try to tell people that, but it's hard. It's a hard concept for people to wrap their mind around.
And it's definitely like a life-changing perception
for sure
of the things that have happened to you. And so is this your first book, like your first introduction to Stoicism?
Yes.
Or have you heard of that before?
I've never heard of it, no.
Okay. So this was one of Holiday's books. I'm not sure which one, but Ryan Holiday introduced me to Stoicism.
For sure.
I had never heard of Stoicism prior to Ryan Holiday, and after reading, it was either this book or Ego is the Enemy, I really went down that rabbit hole of, I read Meditations afterwards by Marcus Aurelius, and then I read some Seneca, and then the Daily Stoic, and in all of his books really like refer to Epictetus and all the founders and the leaders in Stoic thought.
So for the people that don't know what Stoicism is, because I didn't know what it is before you explained it to me, and I started reading the books. How would you describe it to the people?
I would describe it as a very practical philosophy for life, right? It's a philosophy that's all about application and reflection. And it's all about these three things that Holiday pinpoints in this book. It's about perception, action, and will. It's like the idea that you can embrace anything that happens to you. That's Stoicism.
Yep.
That's how I would describe it.
It's a way of life.
It's a way of life. It's a way of looking at life. Yeah. And so moving on, and I say that to say, like, I think this is a great book for an introduction to Stoicism.
For sure.
Yeah. And I like that about Holiday. He's like kind of the, I don't know, the main, what's the word? The leader of like the Stoic movement in modern society.
The poster child.
Yeah, the poster boy of
and I like how he writes this book in a way where he introduces Stoicism to people, and he introduces it in a way where they can understand it.
Yeah.
Anybody that picks up the book can take something from it and apply it to their own life.
For sure.
Something practical.
Yeah, definitely.
And if it's something that you want to engage yourself with and learn more about, then you can for sure do it on your own.
Follow his recommendations.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
His whole list of recommendations. Yeah,
and so from there we'll go on to the second part, which is action. And I really liked his story about Amelia Earhart, right? She wanted to be a great aviator, and women's suffrage was barely even a thing back then, right? And so that was kind of a crazy idea of her to have, right? And then she gets an opportunity to be the first female on a transatlantic flight. She gets a phone call, right? However, the two men would accompany her on this flight, and they would be paid a lot, while she would be paid little to nothing. And she might even die on this trip, right? Like, aviation wasn't as figured out as it is today back then. And so anybody like would logically look at this situation and be like, that's not worth it, that's crazy, but she did it anyway. And as Holiday puts it, because that's what people do who defy the odds. They start anywhere, anyhow. And that's kind of the perception and the action put together. It's she perceived it differently than most people would. She said, this is my opportunity. It may not be the best opportunity or the one that I wanted, but it's an opportunity and I'm willing to take it. And I thought that was a really powerful story that I hadn't heard before.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the lessons that he talked about in the book is within obstacles, there are opportunities, right?
Yeah.
The obstacles, like I mentioned earlier, is what's going to teach you different lessons and different values to improve yourself,
Yeah, definitely. And we could see that too. He gives the example of Thomas Edison. He says in 1878, Thomas Edison wasn't the only person experimenting with incandescent lights, but he was the only man willing to test 6,000 different filaments, proving that genius often really is just persistence in disguise. And I think that's, another powerful idea is just the idea of persisting. No matter what, you're persisting towards the goal.
What's that quote that they always say? Rome wasn't built in one day, but you best believe a brick was being laid down every hour, persistently, every hour, every day, for years.
Constantly chipping away. And then Epictetus has a similar viewpoint to that, right? Epictetus says, persist and resist. Persist in your efforts. Resist in giving into distraction, discouragement, or disorder. And I thought that was really powerful. And there's another thing on page 120 that I'll pull up.
By the way, I read the audiobook.
Yep.
So
how'd you
I liked it.
Is it Holiday reading it?
It's Holiday reading it.
Really?
I always like when the actual author reads it.
Yeah.
And it was really good. It was very enjoyable. My fiance is actually listening to it right now.
Yeah?
Yeah, and she likes it.
Cool.
She said it's helping her out.
Yeah.
Like, okay, there you
That's
go.
cool. Yeah. Spreading it.
Yeah.
So yeah, on page 120,
Uh-huh.
and this is in the action section, right? And I really like this chapter. It's called "Seize the Offensive."
What chapter is it?
Let me see. It is. Oh, he doesn't number the chapters, eh?
No? Okay.
Just "Seize the Offensive."
Okay.
Yeah, page 120. He says, "Perhaps you're stuck in bed recovering. Well, now you have time to write. Perhaps your emotions are overwhelming and painful. Turn it into material. You lost your job or a relationship. That's awful, but now you have time to travel unencumbered. You're having a problem. Now you know exactly what to approach that mentor about. Seize the moment to deploy the plan that has long sat dormant in your head. Every chemical reaction requires a catalyst. Let this be yours."
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought that was a really powerful perspective of, if you're going through a struggle, or if you have to, sit down, like there's always something to be done. There's always a way to be improving on a different
Always.
aspect of your life.
Always. I completely agree with that. You can always be improving yourself, man. You can be reading a book.
Mm-hmm.
You can be maybe listening to the Bookchanging podcast, something to improve yourself and not be stagnant. Because once you're stagnant, the moment you become stagnant is when you start falling behind, especially in this day and age where we're moving so quickly every single day.
Yeah.
The moment you stop, you're going to fall behind,
Yep. And from there we can move on to the third part of the book, which is will, which was my favorite part. And of this, he talked about Abraham Lincoln, which I actually just shared the excerpt on the page. But he says Lincoln's life was defined by enduring and transcending great difficulty. Growing up in rural poverty, losing his mother while he was still a child, educating himself, teaching himself the law, losing the woman he loved as a young man, experiencing multiple defeats at the ballot box as he made his way through politics, and of course the bouts of depression, which at the time were not understood or appreciated as a medical condition. And, we all know what Abe Lincoln was all about, right? He was kind of one of the proponents of freeing the slaves.
Yep.
Right? And Ryan Holiday talked about, would he have been that individual to do that if he had not gone through these struggles? Would he have been strong enough to kind of go against half of the country at the time in order to do that, to fulfill that purpose? And I think that's a really powerful viewpoint of like, this is exactly why Lincoln went through all of those things. It was for him.
For sure.
And he talks about Theodore Roosevelt as well, which again I had no idea, but he says Theodore Roosevelt, having grown up with incredibly bad asthma, Teddy was extremely weak and sickly, but he declared, "I'll make my body," and started to work out feverishly every day for 5 years straight. By his early 20s, the battle against asthma was essentially over. And then to kind of go off on that, he says the path of least resistance is a terrible teacher.
It's just another scenario, another part of the book where somebody they identified that they had maybe something going on with them, a negative, an obstacle, and they chose to look at it differently, and he went ahead to go ahead and work out as hard as he can for the next 5 years of his life, improving his health, Yeah.
And eventually overcoming that, one of the biggest obstacles in his life, which was asthma.
Now, just real quick, one of the stories that he spoke about in the book is, I forgot his name, the name of the boxer.
Yeah, I forgot as well.
Something Douglas. But basically this boxer was a pretty successful boxer back in the days. I don't know his name, but you remember the story, right? So is falsely accused of murder and is sent to jail. And this man, he literally didn't do anything. But what was really interesting to me is how he approached the situation of being in jail.
Yep.
So in the book, it says that when he went to jail, he didn't want to be identified as a prisoner. In fact, that he wasn't dressing up as a prisoner. He wasn't taking any visits from people. He wasn't eating what the prisoners were eating, because he chose to tell himself, you know what? Yes, I'm in this situation, but I'm not gonna let it. I'm not gonna let this
Define.
defy myself. You know, that's what I'm
Yeah.
looking for. And he didn't even go out, and he wasn't making friends with anybody. Instead, he was spending his time learning about the law and how he can get himself out of the situation and educating himself. And he turned the situation of being in jail as a stage in his life where he's improving himself and educating himself. So he ended up spending 18 years in prison for something he did not do, but he never looked at it as something that was bad.
Yeah.
He never looked at it as an obstacle he could not overcome.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, he took out a positive out the situation, and he ended up going to trial 2 different times and beating the case. And I don't think I actually heard afterwards, I was doing a little bit more research about it, that he didn't ask for an apology from the jail system or anybody. He didn't get any lawyers. He just went back to living his life because he felt like if he were to do that, he was giving that system power that they never had in the first place.
Yeah. And I think he mentions that Ego is the enemy with Malcolm X. I don't know if you've gotten to that part, but I believe, because he does write about the boxer, but it's a very similar story with Malcolm X. When Malcolm X goes to prison, he uses that time to learn the law. And so he's reading a lot about
Malcolm X and Nelson Mandela.
Yeah.
I think I literally just listened to that earlier.
Really?
Yeah. Literally.
Yeah. So those are just 2 more examples of people that it took a terrible situation and made it into a positive.
Yeah.
And so I think that, this is a great read.
For sure.
It's like a very precise book. It's really short, but I think it's very powerful.
Yep.
Just a shift in perspective. And I think that's why everybody should read it. I think that's why people should read Ego is the Enemy as well. It's a nice shift in perspective. And I really like the subtitle of this book, The Timeless Art of Turning Trials into Triumph.
Yep.
I think that perfectly describes what this book is all about.
Exactly.
And I think that's why everybody should pick it up and go read it.
For sure. I totally agree with you. I loved it.
Yeah. Any final thoughts you'd like to tell people about the book?
I'm not going to lie, bro. When you recommended me the book, I didn't want to read it. I was like, what is this about? But once I started reading it, I was like, wow, it was definitely, I don't want to say life-changing, but I can definitely apply some of the lessons that I learned in the book to my own life.
Yeah, it's very applicable.
Exactly. And I will say I don't follow Stoicism. I don't necessarily believe that's not my lifestyle. But like we mentioned in the beginning, there are some lessons and some teachings that we may already be doing throughout our life. It doesn't mean you can't learn and apply it to your own life. You know, I have my own belief and my own following, but that doesn't mean I can't learn from this book. You know?
Yeah. And that's and that's funny you say that because now you're even on to Ego is the Enemy.
Yes.
And that's exactly what I did too. Like when I picked up the first book, I went to Ego is the Enemy and then the Daily Stoic and then all of his other work too. So I think that's really cool to hear though.
Yeah.
And I think that people will like to hear that you didn't necessarily want to read the book, but once you started, you were like, this is a good book.
Yeah.
So.
And like I said, doesn't mean you have to follow Stoicism. Doesn't mean you have to be like a student of it. You know, you can definitely, like anything in life, take what you can and apply it to your life, you know, to become a better person.
100%.
I would definitely recommend it to anybody, bro. Like I said, my fiance is reading it right now, so.
All right.
Yeah.
I love it, bro. I appreciate you coming on for another episode.
Man, always. I love coming on here.
Yeah, thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you with another book soon.
For sure. Peace.